There's a bond between a man and his horse that runs deeper than words. When Clayton Rhodes' faithful mount suddenly bolts into the desert heat, the old cowboy trusts his animal's instincts and follows. What he finds will shake him to the core. A prison wagon sits abandoned in the wasteland, 3 terrified people trapped behind iron bars. They aren't criminals, they're jury members for a murder trial, left to die by a corrupt sheriff working for the cattle baron they're meant to judge. Now Clayton has until sundown to get them to the courthouse before a killer walks free. Can one aging cowboy outrun the powerful forces determined to silence justice? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun had barely cleared the eastern ridgeline when Clayton Rhodes finished his second cup of coffee, the bitter brew still steaming in the cool desert air. He sat on a flat rock near the dying embers of his campfire, watching the light spread across the Great Basin like honey poured slow over biscuits. At 58 years old, he'd seen enough sunrises to know that each one was different, each one worth appreciating. That's what Sarah used to tell him anyway, back when she was still around to tell him things. He reached into his worn leather saddlebag and pulled out the small bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The paper had gone soft with handling, the ink slightly smudged in places where his calloused fingers had traced her words too many times. He didn't need to read them anymore, he knew every line by heart, but holding them made her feel closer somehow, made the emptiness of the trail a little less lonely. 3 years next month, he said quietly to the horse grazing nearby. Doesn't get easier, does it, girl? Copperhead lifted her head at the sound of his voice, her dark eyes intelligent and knowing. She was a bay mare, 12 years old, with a copper-coloured coat that caught the light just right when the sun hit it at certain angles. That's how she got her name. Clayton had pulled her from a difficult berth when she was just a foal, stayed up 3 nights running to make sure she'd make it through. She'd been his ever since. And in all those years, she'd never let him down. He tucked the letters back into the saddlebag and stood, feeling the stiffness in his lower back that came with sleeping on hard ground. Used to be, he could sleep anywhere and wake up fresh as morning dew. Now it took him a few minutes of moving around before everything loosened up proper. Getting old wasn't for the faint of heart, that's what his father used to say. The old man had been right about that, just like he'd been right about most things. Clayton kicked dirt over the last of the coals and began breaking down his camp with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd done it 1,000 times. Roll the bedroll tight, secure the cooking gear, check the water situation. He had maybe 2 days' worth if he was careful, which meant he needed to find a creek or a spring before too long. The Great Basin wasn't called great because it was pleasant, it earned that name from its sheer, unforgiving size. He'd lost his ranch 3 years back, right after Sarah passed. Cancer, the doctor had said. Though by the time they'd figured that out it was already too late to do much about it. The medical bills had piled up something fierce, and then without Sarah's steady hand managing the books, Clayton had discovered just how deep in debt they really were. The bank took the property 6 months after he buried her, took 30 years of his life right along with it. Since then, he'd been drifting. Seasonal work mostly. Broke horses for a rancher in Nevada, mended fences in Utah, helped drive cattle up in Montana one summer. Kept moving, kept working, tried not to think too much about what he'd lost. The plan now was to get to Carson City before the first snow hit the high country. He'd heard they needed experienced hands at one of the big spreads just outside of town, and winter work was steady if you could handle the cold. He saddled Copperhead with careful attention, checking every strap and buckle. A man's life depended on his gear being right, especially out here where help was measured in days, not hours. The mare stood patient while he worked, occasionally turning her head to watch him with those knowing eyes. Sometimes he swore she understood every word he said to her, other times he was certain of it. Long day ahead, he told her, patting her neck. But we've had longer. The landscape stretched out before them in waves of sage and scrub, broken occasionally by the dark thrust of volcanic rock or the shimmer of alkali flats. It was beautiful in its own harsh way, if you had the eyes to see it. Most folks just saw wasteland, but Clayton had learned to appreciate the subtle colors, the purple shadows in the draws, the way the rabbit brush turned gold in the fall, the impossible blue of the sky that seemed to go on forever. He'd been raised on a ranch in eastern Oregon, learned to ride before he could properly walk, according to his mother. Spent his whole life around horses and cattle, learning the land and how to read it. His father had taught him to track, to notice the small things that told you about weather and water and the passage of animals and men. Those skills had served him well over the years, kept him alive more than once when things got difficult. Sarah had been a schoolteacher when he met her, new to the territory and looking somewhat lost at the general store in town. He'd been 23, full of himself and sure of everything. She'd been 21, and sharp as a tack, didn't suffer fools gladly. She'd turned him down the first 3 times he asked her to dinner. The 4th time she said yes, and he'd spent the next 35 years grateful for her patience. They'd built the ranch together from nothing, saved every penny, worked dawn to dusk for years. Never had children. That particular blessing hadn't come their way, but they'd had each other, and for a long time that had been enough, more than enough. He mounted up and pointed Copperhead west, toward the shimmering horizon where heat was already beginning to pool in the low places. The mare moved with an easy gait, covering ground without seeming to hurry. They had a good partnership, the two of them. He trusted her instincts, and she trusted his guidance. In the wild country, that kind of trust could mean the difference between living and dying. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the heat. By mid-morning, Clayton had shed his jacket and tied it behind his saddle. He drank sparingly from his canteen, knowing he needed to make it last. The map in his head said there should be a creek about 15 miles ahead, running down from the mountains to the north. If it hadn't dried up, he'd refill there and camp for the night. He'd heard talk in the last town about trouble in these parts. Mining disputes, mostly, with accusations of claim jumping and water rights violations. There'd been mention of a big trial coming up, something about a cattle baron named Thaddeus Mackenzie, who stood accused of murdering a homesteader over grazing land. The whole territory was watching to see how it would play out. Powerful men didn't often face real consequences for their actions, but sometimes, just sometimes, justice found a way. Clayton didn't involve himself in such matters as a rule. He'd learned that taking sides in other people's fights was a quick way to get yourself hurt or killed. But he believed in justice, believed in doing right, even when it cost you something. That's what his father had taught him, and what Sarah had reinforced every day of their marriage. You don't look away when someone needs help. You don't ignore wrong just because it's easier. Around noon, Copperhead suddenly lifted her head, ears swiveling forward with sharp attention. Clayton felt it through the reins before he saw anything that changed in her posture, the tension that came into her muscles. He trusted that response completely. In 12 years, her instincts had never led him wrong. He reined in and sat quiet, letting her show him what had caught her attention. The desert stretched out empty in all directions, just heat shimmer and sage and the distant purple smudge of mountains. Nothing moved except the wind stirring the brush. But Copperhead's nostrils flared, and she took 2 steps forward without being asked, her whole body focused on something Clayton couldn't yet see. He loosened the reins and let her have her head, trusting whatever she'd sensed out there in the emptiness. His right hand drifted down to rest on the rifle in its saddle scabbard, not drawing it, but making sure it was there if needed. The mare began to move faster, shifting from a walk to a trot, and then surprising him she broke into a canter, heading straight toward what looked like nothing but more desert. Clayton leaned forward in the saddle, scanning the horizon, trying to see what she saw, sense what she sensed. And then, maybe half a mile ahead, he caught it. A dark shape that didn't quite belong, something angular where everything else was rounded by wind and time. It could have been a rock formation, could have been shadows playing tricks. But Copperhead seemed certain, and she was galloping now, covering ground with purpose. Clayton's heart began to beat faster. Out here, anything unexpected was worth taking seriously. He kept his seat and let the mare run, his eyes fixed on that dark shape growing slowly larger as they approached. Whatever it was, Copperhead had decided it mattered. And Clayton Rhodes had learned long ago that when your horse tells you something's wrong, you'd better listen. The prison wagon materialized from the heat shimmer like something out of a fever dream. At first, Clayton thought his eyes were deceiving him. Desert mirages could conjure all sorts of impossible things. But as Copperhead closed the distance, the wagon became solid and real, sitting motionless in a shallow depression, surrounded by sagebrush and scattered volcanic rock. It was a heavy thing, built for purpose rather than comfort. Iron bars formed a cage in the back, and the whole structure was painted a faded black that had been scoured grey by years of sun and sand. The driver's bench sat empty, reins trailing in the dust. No horses in sight. No sign of whoever had been driving it. Clayton slowed Copperhead to a walk as they approached, his hand now firmly on his rifle. His instincts were screaming that something was badly wrong here. Prison wagons didn't just appear in the middle of nowhere without guards, without horses, without explanation. "Hello, the wagon," he called out, his voice carrying across the stillness. "Anyone there?" For a moment, nothing. Then he heard it, a rasping sound, like someone trying to speak through a throat gone dry as parchment. Movement behind the bars, shadows shifting. He dismounted carefully, keeping the wagon in sight as he tied Copperhead to a sturdy piece of sage. The mare snorted and stamped, still agitated. Clayton pulled his rifle from the scabbard and approached on foot, ready for anything. Out here, you didn't take chances. As he came around to the back of the wagon, he saw them. 3 people huddled in the iron cage, their faces sun-scorched and desperate. A man in a dusty black suit that might have been fine once, a woman in a simple grey dress, and another man wearing clothes that marked him as a shopkeeper or clerk. They weren't chained, but they were locked in, and they looked like they'd been there for some time. "Water," the woman whispered, her lips cracked and bleeding. "Please, if you have any mercy." Clayton lowered his rifle and moved quickly back to Copperhead, pulling his canteen from the saddle. He returned to the wagon and passed it through the bars. The woman drank first, just a few swallows before the man in the black suit gently took it from her and did the same. They shared it among the 3 of them with a discipline that spoke of people who understood rationing, who knew how precious water could be. "How long have you been out here?" Clayton asked, studying their condition. Sunburned, dehydrated, but still alert enough to be careful with the water. Not as far gone as they might have been. "Since yesterday morning," the shopkeeper said, his voice hoarse but steadier after the water. "Maybe 18 hours. Feels like a lifetime. Where's your driver? Where are the horses?" The 3 exchanged glances, and Clayton saw fear pass between them. Not fear of him, fear of something else, something worse. The man in the black suit spoke, and Clayton recognized the measured cadence of someone educated, someone used to weighing his words carefully. "We need to explain something to you, and it's going to sound impossible. But every word is true, and 3 lives depend on you believing us." Clayton waited, watching their faces. He'd always been good at reading people, at knowing when someone was spinning tales and when they were speaking truth. These 3 were terrified, but they weren't lying. "We're not criminals," the woman said quietly. "We're members of a jury. The Mackenzie trial, have you heard of it?" Clayton's jaw tightened. He'd heard of it, all right. Thaddeus Mackenzie, cattle baron accused of murdering a homesteader named Jeremiah Porter over a water rights dispute. The trial had been the talk of every town and camp for 100 miles. Mackenzie had money, power, and connections that reached all the way to the territorial capital. "Go on," he said. The shopkeeper leaned forward, gripping the bars. "We were sequestered 3 days ago, locked in the hotel in Ridgemont, not allowed to talk to anyone, guarded around the clock. This morning, a man wearing a deputy's badge came and said the judge had ordered us transported to the courthouse in Sterling for the final day of testimony. Said it was a security precaution. Except he wasn't a real deputy." The man in black continued. "We didn't realize it until we were already out here. He drove us into the desert, took the horses, and left us to die. Told us, Mackenzie sends his regards." The words hung in the hot air like stones dropped in still water. Clayton felt something cold settle in his chest, despite the heat. This was worse than simple crime. This was corruption that reached into the heart of the law itself. "If we don't make it to the courthouse by sundown," the woman said, her voice shaking, "the judge will have to declare a mistrial. No jury, no verdict. Mackenzie walks free, and Jeremiah Porter's murder goes unpunished. That's what this is about. They're not just trying to kill us, they're trying to kill justice itself." Clayton looked at the lock on the wagon door. Heavy iron, well made. He didn't have tools to pick it, and shooting it off would waste ammunition he might need. But he did have a crowbar in his gear, might be able to pry it open if he worked at it. "How far to Sterling?" he asked. 25 miles, maybe 30, the shopkeeper said. "But this wagon, even if you could get the lock off, even if we had horses, it's too heavy, too slow. We'd never make it in time." Clayton pulled out his pocket watch, the one Sarah had given him for their 10th anniversary. The crystal was scratched, but the mechanism still kept perfect time. 3:15 in the afternoon. If they needed to be at the courthouse by sundown, that gave them maybe 3.5 hours. 4 at the most. He looked at Copperhead, standing patient in the sage. She was strong, but she couldn't carry 4 people, and certainly not at the speed they'd need. He looked at the wagon, at the 3 desperate faces behind the bars. He thought about Sarah, about what she would say if she were here. He already knew the answer. "There's a station about 6 miles north of here," he said slowly, working through the possibilities in his mind. "Stage, stop on the old freight route. Might have horses, might have a wagon that's lighter than this thing. If it's still operating." "And if it's not?" the woman asked. Clayton met her eyes. "Then we figure something else, but giving up isn't on the table. Not while there's breath in my body and time on the clock." He moved to the lock and examined it more closely. It was solid, but the hasp it connected to was mounted to the wagon frame with bolts that looked older than the lock itself. Wood and iron, both stressed by years of sun and temperature changes. He might not be able to break the lock, but he could break what it was attached to. "I'm going to get you out," he said, "and then we're going to ride hard and hope luck is with us. What are your names?" "Reverend Thomas Ashford," said the man in black. "Margaret Chen," said the woman. "I teach school in Ridgemont." "William Brennan. I ran a dry goods store." Clayton nodded at each of them. "Clayton Rhodes. My friends call me Dusty. Now let's get you free and figure out how to save this trial before that murdering cattle baron walks away clean." He went back to Copperhead and started pulling tools from his saddlebags. The crowbar, a hammer, anything that might help. The sun beat down without mercy, and somewhere ahead of them, in a courthouse in Sterling, a judge was waiting. The clock was ticking, and every minute counted. Justice hung in the balance, and an aging cowboy with a loyal horse and 3 desperate strangers were all that stood between a killer and freedom. It took Clayton 20 minutes of hard work to break the hasp free. The bolts had rusted into the wood, and even with the crowbar and hammer working together, it was a struggle. Sweat poured down his face and soaked through his shirt, but he kept at it, methodical and determined. When the final bolt gave way with a shriek of protesting metal, the door swung open, and the 3 jury members practically fell out onto the desert floor. Margaret Chen collapsed to her knees immediately, her legs unable to hold her after so many hours cramped in the iron cage. Reverend Ashford caught himself against the wagon wheel, breathing hard. Only William Brennan managed to stay upright, though he swayed like a man who'd had too much whiskey. "Easy now," Clayton said, steadying the Reverend. "Take your time. Your bodies need a minute to remember how to work right." He helped Margaret to her feet and guided all 3 of them to a patch of shade beside the wagon. It wasn't much relief from the heat, but it was better than nothing. He gave them more water, still rationing it carefully, and watched their color start to improve. They were in rough shape, but they were survivors, all 3 of them. You could see it in their eyes, in the way they'd kept themselves together despite everything. "We need to move soon," William said, rubbing feeling back into his legs. "Every minute we sit here is a minute closer to sundown." "I know," Clayton replied, But you three aren't ready to move fast yet, and if we push too hard too soon, you'll collapse before we get anywhere useful. Better to take 10 minutes now and save an hour later. It was something he'd learned over years of working cattle and horses, the difference between haste and speed. Haste got you in trouble. Speed got you where you needed to be. The trick was knowing which one you were employing. Reverend Ashford pulled a small worn Bible from his coat pocket, and Clayton watched as several folded papers fell out from between the pages. The Reverend gathered them quickly, but not before Clayton glimpsed official seals and dense legal text. The jury summons papers, most likely. Evidence of who they were and why they mattered. "You kept those?" Margaret asked quietly. "Seemed important," Ashford replied, tucking them back into the Bible. "Physical proof of what was done to us. If something happens, if we don't make it, someone should know the truth." Clayton understood that impulse. Leave evidence behind, leave witnesses to what happened. It was the same reason he still carried Sarah's letters. Some things needed to be preserved, needed to be remembered. "We're going to make it," he said firmly, "but we need to be smart about this. Margaret, can you ride?" She looked up at him with exhausted eyes. "I've ridden before, not often, but I can manage." "William?" "Same. I'm not going to win any races, but I can stay in a saddle." "Reverend?" Ashford managed a thin smile. "I served as a missionary in California for 5 years. Spent more time on horseback than in churches. I can ride." Clayton nodded, already revising his plans. If they could all ride, that opened up possibilities. The station might have mounts available, though there was no guarantee it was even still operating. The old freight routes had been gradually abandoned as the railroad pushed through, and many of the stations had closed or been converted to other uses. "Here's what we're looking at," he said, laying it out clearly. 6 miles to the station, roughly north-northwest. If we're lucky, they have horses and we can ride straight for Sterling. If we're not lucky, we walk, and we don't make it in time. It's that simple. "What about water?" Margaret asked. "You've shared your canteen, but 4 people in this heat." "There's a spring near the station. Old Marcus Freeman used to keep it cleared for travelers. If he's still there, we'll be fine. If he's not," Clayton paused, considering, "we'll deal with that when we come to it." He helped them to their feet one by one, assessing their condition with a practiced eye. Margaret was the most affected by the dehydration and heat, but she had iron in her spine. You could see it in the set of her jaw. William was soft from years behind a store counter, but he was younger than the other two and had some reserves left. Ashford was in the best shape, surprisingly. Life as a missionary must have toughened him up more than his refined manner suggested. "We'll walk for the first mile," Clayton decided. "Let your bodies remember how to move. Save Copperhead's strength for when we really need it. One of you can ride if you start to fail, but we need to keep her as fresh as possible." They set out slowly, leaving the prison wagon behind like a monument to corruption in the middle of the wasteland. Clayton led Copperhead, and the 3 jury members walked in a line behind him, helping each other when the ground got rough. The sun hammered down without mercy, and the landscape shimmered with heat. As they walked, Clayton's mind was already ranging ahead, calculating distances and times, weighing options. 6 miles to the station meant maybe 2 hours on foot, less if they could pick up the pace. Then, time to assess what was available, to saddle horses if there were any, to organize and move out. Even in the best case, they'd be cutting it close. And that was assuming the station had what they needed, assuming there were horses, assuming they didn't run into whatever corrupt forces Mackenzie had working for him. A cattle baron with enough money to buy off fake deputies probably had more resources at his disposal. They might not be safe, even if they made it to Sterling. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said from behind him, her breathing labored but steady. "Go ahead. Why are you helping us? You could have ridden on, pretended you never saw that wagon. No one would have blamed you." Clayton was quiet for a moment, listening to the crunch of their footsteps on the hardpan, the sound of Copperhead's breathing beside him. He thought about Sarah, about the ranch they'd lost, about all the years of working hard and trying to do right. "My wife used to say that the measure of a person isn't what they do when people are watching, he said finally. "It's what they do when no one would ever know. Out here, there's no one watching. There's just us and the desert and the choice we make. I choose to help because that's who I am. That's who I was raised to be." "Your wife sounds like she was a wise woman," Reverend Ashford said softly. "She was the best person I ever knew," Clayton replied, "and she'd have stopped to help you, no question about it. So, that's what I'm doing." They walked on through the heat, 4 people bound together by circumstance and necessity, racing against a deadline they couldn't see but could feel in their bones. Somewhere ahead lay the station, and hope, and the possibility of making this right. Behind them lay only the empty desert and an abandoned prison wagon, testimony to how far corruption could reach. Clayton checked his watch again. 3:35. The sun had a long way to fall yet, but not long enough. They needed to move faster, needed luck to break their way. He offered a silent prayer to whoever might be listening, asking for the strength to see this through, for the station to have what they needed, for justice to win out over money and power. Then he tucked the watch away and kept walking. Prayer was fine, but action was better. They had miles to cover, and not much time to cover them. After the first mile, they found a rhythm. Margaret rode Copperhead for a stretch while the men walked, then William took a turn, then Ashford. Clayton rotated them every 20 minutes, keeping everyone moving, keeping everyone from wearing out completely. The mayor accepted the changes with patient grace, seeming to understand the urgency even if she couldn't know the details. As they walked, Reverend Ashford told Clayton about the trial, about Jeremiah Porter, the homesteader who'd filed legal claim to a water source that Thaddeus Mackenzie considered his own, about the confrontation that had escalated from words to violence, ending with Porter shot dead in front of his pregnant wife and 2 young children. "There were witnesses," Ashford explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. 3 men who saw Mackenzie draw his gun and fire. But within a week, 2 of them had left the territory, and the 3rd recanted his testimony, said he'd been mistaken about what he saw. "Money or threats?" Clayton asked. "Both, most likely. Mackenzie has plenty of each to spread around." But Porter's wife, Rebecca, she insisted on justice, went to the territorial prosecutor herself, demanded they bring charges. The prosecutor actually did it, probably because the case was so public he couldn't ignore it. That's how we ended up with a trial. Margaret's voice came from where she rode Copperhead a few paces ahead. "The trial's been going for 5 days. Mackenzie's lawyers have been tearing apart every piece of evidence, intimidating witnesses, making it all seem like self-defense. But yesterday, a new witness came forward, a ranch hand who was there, and saw everything. His testimony was devastating. Clear, detailed, unshakable. That's when they decided to make us disappear," William added. "Last night, we could hear them talking in the hallway outside our rooms. They thought we were asleep, but we weren't. They said Mackenzie was going to hang, unless something was done. This morning, the fake deputy showed up." Clayton felt his jaw clench. He'd seen corruption before. It wasn't new in the territories, where law was still being established and money talked loud. But this was brazen, desperate. Mackenzie must have known that losing this trial meant more than just a murder conviction. It meant his empire would crumble, his power would evaporate, his name would be forever stained. "How much time left on the trial?" he asked. "The judge said closing arguments today, deliberation and verdict by sundown," Ashford replied. "That's why the timing matters so much. No jury, no verdict. The case would have to start over from the beginning, and in 6 months or a year, witnesses disappear, memories fade, evidence gets lost. Mackenzie would walk eventually." The sun beat down, and the miles passed slowly. Clayton watched his charges carefully, noting when their steps began to drag, when their breathing got too labored. He pushed them as hard as he dared, but not harder. A person could only take so much, especially in this heat, especially after what they'd been through. Around 4:15, they crested a low rise and saw the station below. It sat in a natural depression where runoff collected during the rare rains, creating enough moisture to sustain a few cottonwood trees and a patch of struggling grass. The building itself was adobe and wood, weathered but still standing. A corral stood empty beside it, and no smoke rose from the chimney. "Looks abandoned," William said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Maybe," Clayton replied, but Marcus Freeman was stubborn as a Missouri mule. "Let's get down there and see." They covered the last quarter-mile quickly, desperation lending them energy they didn't really have. As they approached, Clayton could see that the station had indeed been abandoned, but not recently. The windows were intact, the door closed properly, the corral fence in decent repair. Someone had left it in good condition, expecting to come back, or expecting someone else to make use of it. He tried the door and found it unlocked. Inside, the single large room was dim and cool, dust motes dancing in the shafts of light that came through the windows. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a wooden table and chairs sat in the center, and shelves lined the other walls holding supplies. In the corner, a guest ledger sat open on a small desk, its pages yellowed but legible. Margaret moved to the ledger while Clayton checked the rest of the station. He found the spring out back, water still flowing clear and cold from a crack in the rock. Relief flooded through him. At least they wouldn't die of thirst. But the corral remained empty, and a quick search of the property revealed no horses, no wagon, nothing with 4 legs, and the ability to carry them to Sterling. "Last entry is from 3 months ago," Margaret called from inside. "Freight haulers heading to Virginia City. Before that, entries are sporadic, maybe 1 a month." Clayton came back in and looked at the ledger. Names and dates, a record of travelers who'd passed through when this route was still active. The writing was different hands, different styles, but all told the same story. This was a place of transition, of brief rest, before moving on. Now it was just an empty building in the desert, waiting for a purpose it no longer had. "No horses," he said flatly. "We're going to have to make other plans." The 3 jury members looked at him, with varying degrees of despair. They'd been counting on this station, counting on finding something here that would save them. The weight of that disappointment settled on the room like a physical thing. But Clayton had spent most of his life dealing with setbacks and making do with what he had. You didn't survive in ranch country by giving up when the first plan failed. You adapted, you improvised, you kept moving forward. "Here's what we have," he said, laying it out like he was planning a cattle drive. "Water, shelter if we need it, and supplies. Marcus kept this place stocked for emergencies. There's jerky, hardtack, dried fruit. We can rest for 15 minutes, eat something, drink properly. Get your strength back." "And then what?" William asked. "We're still 20 miles from Sterling with no horses, and maybe 3 hours until sundown, even if we could run the whole way." "We can't run 20 miles, Clayton agreed. "But we can ride 1 horse 20 miles if we're smart about it. Copperhead's strong, and she's had breaks while you 3 were walking. We rotate riders, 2 on at a time, 3rd person jogging behind. The one on the ground gets a break, while the other 2 ride. We keep that rotation going. We can cover ground faster than walking and keep everyone from wearing out." Reverend Ashford studied him with new respect. "That might actually work. It'll be brutal, but it might work." "It has to work," Margaret said quietly. "Rebecca Porter and her children deserve justice. Jeremiah deserves justice." Clayton moved to the shelves and started pulling down supplies. Jerky, hardtack, a few tins that might hold fruit or beans. Not much, but enough to give them energy for the push ahead. He filled his canteen from the spring and passed it around, making sure everyone drank their fill. 15 minutes, he said, pulling out his watch. "Rest, eat, drink, then we ride hard, and hope the Lord favors the righteous." Through the window he could see the sun beginning its long descent toward the western horizon. Time was running out, and they still had so far to go. But they weren't beaten yet. Not while they had breath and will and a horse willing to carry them toward justice. They left the station at 4:45 with renewed determination and bodies fortified by food and water. Clayton had them mounted double Margaret and William together, with Ashford jogging behind. Every 10 minutes they'd rotate, keeping fresh legs on the ground and fresh weight in the saddle. It was brutal, exactly as Ashford had predicted, but it was also faster than walking and sustainable for longer than any single person running. Copperhead took to the arrangement with the same patient acceptance she'd shown all day. Clayton talked to her constantly as they moved, praising her strength, encouraging her forward, letting her know how important this was. She couldn't understand the words, but she understood his tone, his touch, his trust in her. That was enough. The terrain gradually shifted as they headed east. The flat basin gave way to rolling hills cut with dry washes and dotted with juniper. It was harder going, more elevation change, more obstacles to navigate around. Clayton picked the path carefully, balancing speed against the risk of injury. A turned ankle now would doom them all. "Tell me about your wife," Margaret said during her rotation on the ground, jogging beside Clayton with surprising endurance for a schoolteacher. "You mentioned her earlier." Clayton was quiet for a moment, then began to talk. About Sarah, about the ranch, about 35 years of marriage that had been the center of his life. He found himself sharing details he hadn't spoken aloud in months, how she'd laugh at his terrible jokes, how she could calm a spooked horse with just her voice, how she'd faced her death with more courage than he could have mustered. "She sounds remarkable," Margaret said softly when he finished. "She was, still is, in my memory. Some people leave such a mark on you that they never really go away. My husband died in a mining accident 4 years ago," she said. "I understand about marks that don't fade." They ran on in companionable silence after that, two people who'd known loss and learned to carry it. Clayton found himself respecting this woman more with each passing mile. She was tough in ways that didn't show on the surface, resilient in ways that mattered. Around 5:30, with the sun beginning to paint the western sky in shades of orange and gold, William spotted something behind them. "Dust!" he called out from where he rode with Ashford. "Maybe a mile back." Clayton reined in and turned to look. Sure enough, a plume of dust rose against the sky, too thick and sustained to be caused by wind. Someone was following them, moving fast. "How many riders would kick up that much?" Reverend Ashford asked, his missionary experience showing in the calmness of his voice. "3, maybe 4, Clayton replied, studying the pattern. "Could be coincidence. Could be Mackenzie's men figured out what happened." "Do we run?" Margaret asked. Clayton checked his watch. 5:32. The sun would set around 7, maybe a few minutes after. Sterling was still maybe 8 miles ahead, possibly less if they'd been making better time than he'd estimated. They couldn't outrun horsemen, not with 4 people rotating on one tired mare. But they might not have to. "We keep moving," he decided. "Same pace, same rotation, but everyone stays alert. If they catch up to us, we'll deal with it then." He pulled his rifle from the saddle scabbard and checked the load. 5 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. Not much for a sustained fight, but enough to make anyone think twice about pushing things too hard. He had his revolver as well, 6 rounds there, against 4 men that might not be enough, but it was what he had to work with. They pressed on, and the dust cloud behind them grew closer. Whoever was following had spotted them and was closing the distance. Clayton's mind raced through options. They could try to hide, but there was precious little cover in this terrain. They could try to ambush their pursuers, but that meant stopping and losing precious time. They could— "There," Ashford said suddenly, pointing ahead. "Smoke." Clayton looked and saw it, a thin column rising from beyond the next hill. Where there was smoke, there were people. Maybe a ranch, maybe a camp, maybe just travelers. But people meant witnesses, meant complications for anyone trying to do violence in the open. It might be enough. "Change of plans," Clayton said. "William, Margaret, both of you on Copperhead now. Ashford, you're with me. We're going to move faster and head straight for that smoke. If those riders behind us have bad intentions, they might think twice about showing them in front of witnesses." They reorganized quickly, and Clayton urged Copperhead into a canter, something he'd been avoiding to save her strength. The mare responded gamely, carrying her double burden with determination. Clayton and Ashford ran behind, their legs burning with effort, lungs working hard in the dry air. The hill ahead loomed larger, and the dust cloud behind grew closer still. Clayton could hear the distant sound of hoofbeats now, echoing across the landscape. 4 horses, definitely, moving with purpose and speed. His hand tightened on his rifle, and he felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier on his shoulders. 3 people trusted him to get them to Sterling alive. He wasn't about to let them down. They crested the hill and saw the source of the smoke below, a small ranch house, weathered but well-maintained, with a barn and several outbuildings. Cattle grazed in a fenced pasture, and chickens scratched in the yard. A man stood near the house, watching their approach with the cautious interest of someone who lived far enough from town to be wary of unexpected visitors. "Friendly," Clayton called out as they approached, keeping his rifle pointed down. "We need to pass through, if you don't mind. Got people following us who might not be so friendly." The rancher was maybe 40, weathered by sun and work, with intelligent eyes that took in their condition quickly. He glanced past them at the dust cloud approaching and seemed to make a decision. "Come on in," he said. "Name's Jack Riley. You folks look like you've had a hard day." "That's one way to put it," Clayton replied, helping Margaret and William down from Copperhead. "We've got about 10 minutes before those riders catch up. You should know there might be trouble." Riley nodded slowly. "I don't care much for men who chase tired horses and exhausted people. Why don't you catch your breath in my barn while I have a conversation with whoever's following you? I expect they'll be reasonable once they understand the situation." He disappeared into the house and came back out carrying a shotgun, which he held with the comfortable ease of someone who knew how to use it. Clayton felt some of the tension ease from his shoulders. They weren't alone anymore. Whatever was coming, they'd face it with help. The hoofbeats grew louder, and 4 riders appeared over the hill behind them. They slowed when they saw the ranch, saw Riley standing there with his shotgun, saw that their quarry had found shelter. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the lead rider raised his hand in what might have been a wave or a gesture of surrender, and the 4 of them turned their horses and rode back the way they'd come. "Friends of yours?" Riley asked dryly. "Not even close," Clayton replied. "And I suspect they'll be back with more friends once they figure out where we're headed. We need to keep moving." Riley looked at the sun, at Copperhead's heaving sides, at the exhausted faces of the 3 jury members. "You'll never make Sterling before dark at this pace. But I've got a wagon and a fresh team. If you need to be somewhere urgently, I can help with that." Jack Riley moved fast. Within 10 minutes he had a light wagon hitched to a pair of strong draft horses, had loaded Clayton's gear, and given Copperhead a quick rub-down and a bucket of oats. The mare deserved the rest. She'd earned it 10 times over today. Clayton thanked her properly, running his hand along her neck, promising her better care when this was done. "She's a good one," Riley said, watching the exchange. "Loyal. That's rare in horses, and rarer in people." They got the 3 jury members settled in the wagon bed with blankets for cushioning. Riley took the reins, Clayton sat beside him on the bench, and they rolled out fast, the fresh horses eager and strong. The sun sat lower now, maybe an hour from touching the horizon. They had time, but not much of it. As they drove, Riley explained that he knew about the Mackenzie trial. Everyone in the territory knew about it. Thaddeus Mackenzie had ruled the Eastern Range like a king for 20 years, building his empire through a combination of shrewd business and ruthless intimidation. Most people were afraid to cross him. Those who did often regretted it. "I met Jeremiah Porter once," Riley said, his hands steady on the reins. "He came through here looking for land to homestead, asked my advice about water rights and grazing. Honest man, hard-working, had dreams for his family. Didn't deserve what happened to him." "Nobody deserves to be murdered over water," Clayton replied. "True enough. But Mackenzie sees it different. He's old school, believes the land belongs to whoever's strong enough to hold it. Legal claims and government papers don't mean much to him. He was here before most of the law arrived, and he thinks that gives him special rights." Clayton understood that mentality. He'd seen it in Montana, in Wyoming, in Nevada. Men who'd carved out territory through force and will, who resented the encroachment of civilization and order. Some of them adapted, others fought. Mackenzie was clearly a fighter. "You served?" Clayton asked, noticing the way Riley handled himself. The easy competence that came with military training. "Cavalry, 10 years, Riley confirmed. 3rd Regiment, saw action in the Apache campaigns down south, did some time in Wyoming during the range wars. Got out 5 years ago, bought this place with my discharge pay and some money I'd saved." He reached under the wagon bench and pulled out a small leather case, flipping it open to show Clayton a tarnished badge, 3rd Cavalry, with his name and rank engraved on the back. It was the kind of thing a man kept as a reminder of who he'd been, what he'd done. Clayton understood that too. "I left the fighting behind when I left the service," Riley continued, "but I haven't forgotten how to do it if necessary. And I sure as hell won't stand by while corrupt men try to murder innocent people to escape justice." In the wagon bed, Reverend Ashford spoke up. "You're risking a lot for strangers, Mr. Riley. If Mackenzie finds out you helped us—" "Let him find out," Riley said flatly. "I didn't survive 10 years in the cavalry by being afraid of bullies. Mackenzie's just another bully with money. He bleeds the same as anyone else if you cut him." Clayton felt a kinship with this man, this former soldier who'd found peace on a small ranch but hadn't lost the steel that had kept him alive through hard years. There were good people scattered throughout these territories, people who stood up when it mattered. Sometimes you just had to find them. The wagon rattled on through the early evening, the draft horses maintaining a steady pace that ate up the miles. Clayton checked his watch obsessively now, watching the minutes tick past. 6:15. 6:30, 6:45. The sun touched the horizon, painting the world in shades of red and orange that were beautiful and terrifying at the same time. "How much farther?" Margaret asked, her voice tight with anxiety. 5 miles, maybe less," Riley replied. "We'll make it. These horses have more in them yet." Clayton studied the road ahead, looking for any signs of trouble. He wouldn't put it past Mackenzie to have more men watching the approaches to Sterling, ready to intercept them. But the road remained empty. Just the wagon and the fading light and the distant smudge of buildings that marked their destination. William Brennan spoke from the wagon bed, his voice reflective. "I've been thinking about why I said yes when they called me for jury duty. Most people try to get out of it. It's inconvenient. It disrupts your life. It doesn't pay well. But I said yes because I believe in the system. I believe that ordinary people coming together to judge the facts is better than letting the powerful decide everything." "That's why they tried to kill you," Ashford said quietly. "Because your belief in that system threatens their power." "Not just threatens it," Margaret added, "destroys it. If we get to that courthouse, if we deliver our verdict, it proves that money and influence can't buy everything. That justice actually means something, even for people like Mackenzie." Clayton listened to them talk and felt something settle inside him. This wasn't just about saving 3 lives, though that would have been reason enough. This was about something larger, about whether law meant anything, whether ordinary people had power, whether the system could actually work the way it was supposed to. That was worth fighting for. That was worth the risk. "My wife believed in the system too," he said, surprising himself by speaking. "She served on a jury once, convicted a man of cattle rustling when half the town wanted to let him off because he was popular. She got threats for months afterward, people saying she'd ruined a good man's life. But she stood by her decision because she believed the evidence was clear and the law was the law." "She sounds like she had courage," Margaret said. "More than I'll ever have," Clayton replied. "But she also taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right, even when you're afraid. All 4 of us are afraid right now. Those riders scared us. The deadline scares us. What might happen if we fail scares us. But we're still going." The buildings of Sterling began to take shape ahead, solid and real in the dying light. The courthouse would be somewhere in the center of town, probably near the main square. Clayton had been through Sterling once before, years ago, but he remembered the layout well enough. They just needed to find it and get these 3 people inside before the judge called time. Riley urged the horses faster, and they responded with a final surge of effort. The wagon bounced over the rough road, and everyone held on tight. Behind them, the sun touched the horizon and began to sink below it. The sky blazed with color, and shadows lengthened across the land. "Almost there," Riley said, his voice carrying both determination and relief. Almost there. Clayton pulled his rifle across his lap, just in case. They were close now, so close, but close wasn't the same as safe, and he wouldn't relax until these three were standing in front of that judge, telling their story, reclaiming their role as instruments of justice. The wagon rolled into Sterling as the last light faded from the sky, and everything that had happened that day, the prison wagon, the desert, the chase, the desperate race against time, all of it came down to these final moments. Either they made it, or they didn't. Either justice prevailed, or corruption won. There was no middle ground, no room for compromise. Clayton Rhodes, aging cowboy with a loyal horse and a dead wife's letters in his saddlebag, had never felt more alive or more afraid. But he was here, and he was ready to see this through to whatever end waited for them in that courthouse ahead. The courthouse stood 3 stories tall in the center of Sterling's main square, an imposing structure of stone and timber that spoke of permanence and authority. Light blazed from every window, and a crowd had gathered on the steps and spilled into the street. Something was happening, something that had drawn half the town out to watch. Riley pulled the wagon to a stop as close as he could get, and they all climbed down quickly. Clayton's legs protested after the long ride, but adrenaline carried him forward. They pushed through the crowd, ignoring questions and curious stares, focused only on getting inside. The courtroom was packed, every bench filled, people standing along the walls, the air thick with tension and body heat. At the front, an elderly judge sat behind his bench, his face carved with deep lines that spoke of long years enforcing the law. To his left, the prosecution table. To his right, Thaddeus Mackenzie sat with 3 expensive lawyers, his silver hair and tailored suit radiating power and confidence. "Your Honor," Clayton called out, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd, "we have the missing jury members." Every head turned. The murmur became a roar of surprise and speculation. The judge hammered his gavel for silence, his eyes locked on Clayton and the 3 people with him. Mackenzie's face went through a remarkable transformation, shock, fury, calculation, all in the space of 2 seconds. "Approach," the judge ordered. They moved forward together. Margaret, William, and Reverend Ashford looked exhausted but determined. Clayton stayed close, ready to corroborate whatever they said. The judge studied them with shrewd eyes, then looked past them to where the jury box sat. That's when Clayton saw it. The jury box wasn't empty. 9 people sat there, looking uncomfortable and confused. 9 people, not 0. 9 people when there should have been none. "I don't understand," Margaret whispered. "Who are they?" The judge leaned forward. "Before we go any further, I need to understand what's happening here. Miss Chen, I'm told you're a sequestered juror in this trial. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor. I was one of 12 jurors. We were sequestered 3 days ago. This morning, a man claiming to be a deputy transported me and 2 other jurors into the desert and abandoned us to die. We were only rescued because this man," she gestured to Clayton, "found us and brought us here." The courtroom erupted again. The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. "Order! I will have order!" When silence returned, he looked at the 9 people in the jury box. "Which of you were also part of the original 12? 6 hands went up slowly. 6 people who'd been sequestered, who'd heard all the evidence, who were supposed to deliver the verdict. That meant 3 people in the jury box hadn't been there before. "This is an outrage." One of Mackenzie's lawyers stood up, his voice smooth and confident. "Your Honor, this trial has been compromised beyond repair. We move for an immediate mistrial. The jury has clearly been tampered with." "Sit down, Mr. Harrison," the judge said coldly. "You'll speak when I tell you to speak." He turned to his bailiff, a grey-haired man with a face like weathered granite. "Sheriff Morrison, explain to me how we have 9 jurors present when this morning I was told 3 were missing and 3 others had fled in fear." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, and Clayton felt ice slide down his spine. This was the town sheriff, the real law in Sterling. If he was on Mackenzie's payroll— "Your Honor," Morrison said, his voice steady and clear. "This morning, when the jury failed to appear from the hotel, I investigated. I found 3 jurors had indeed been removed by someone wearing a deputy's uniform, a uniform we have now determined was stolen from our office 2 days ago. The remaining 9 jurors were terrified. 3 of them refused to continue, saying they feared for their lives. I have their sworn statements to that effect. He pulled papers from his jacket and handed them to the judge. With 3 jurors missing and 3 refusing to serve, you had no choice but to consider dismissal. However, I took the liberty of contacting the county clerk. Under territorial law, when a jury is compromised by criminal interference, the court may seat alternates if they're available and have heard substantially similar evidence. There are no alternates in this case, the prosecutor said, rising from his table. We didn't seat any. No, Morrison agreed. But the territorial circuit judge, who happens to be in Sterling on other business, suggested an alternative approach. He authorized the seating of 3 respected citizens who have followed this trial closely in the newspapers and public gallery. They've heard every day of testimony from the gallery. While not ideal, it preserves the right to trial by jury while protecting against criminal interference. Clayton's mind raced. This wasn't standard procedure, it couldn't be. But if a circuit judge had authorized it, if it was legal under territorial law, then maybe— Who authorized this? Mackenzie's lawyer demanded. On whose authority? On mine, a new voice said from the back of the courtroom. An elderly man walked down the center aisle, his bearing commanding despite his age. He wore a black suit and carried a walking stick that he didn't seem to need. When he reached the front, he turned to address the room. I am Circuit Judge Augustus Trent. I've been riding this territory for 30 years, and I know every law on the books and a few that should be. When Sheriff Morrison came to me this morning with evidence of jury tampering in an active murder trial, I exercised my authority under Section 47 of the Territorial Code to ensure this trial could proceed. He fixed Mackenzie with a stare that could have cut glass. Mr. Mackenzie, it appears someone went to extraordinary lengths to ensure you wouldn't face a verdict today. That alone tells me everything I need to know about your guilt or innocence, but we'll let the jury decide that. Margaret stepped forward. Your Honor, both your honors, I need to tell you what happened to us. We were taken into the desert by a man wearing a deputy's badge. He told us Mackenzie sent his regards, then left us to die. If not for Mr. Rhodes here, we'd be dead now, and this trial would have ended. The original judge looked at Clayton. You're the one who found them? My horse found them, Your Honor. I just followed. A ripple of laughter went through the courtroom, but it was nervous laughter, tension seeking release. The judge wasn't laughing. Neither was Mackenzie, whose face had gone pale beneath his tan. This is extraordinary, the original judge, whose nameplate read Judge Hammond, said slowly. We have 9 seated jurors, 3 of whom are substitutes authorized by Circuit Judge Trent. We have 3 original jurors who were criminally interfered with but have now returned. The question is, what do we do? Trent leaned on his walking stick, and Clayton realized the old man was enjoying this. The law is clear, Judge Hammond. The 3 original jurors take precedence, the 3 substitutes step down, we have our 12 again, and the trial proceeds to verdict. This is a mockery, Mackenzie's lawyer shouted. You cannot possibly. I can and I will, Hammond said, his voice like iron. The defense has already rested, the prosecution has already rested. Closing arguments were delivered before the jury disappeared. All that remains is deliberation and verdict. The 12 original jurors will now retire to consider their verdict. He looked at Margaret, William, and Ashford. You 3 have been through hell today, and I'm sorry for that, but your duty isn't finished yet. Join your fellow jurors, hear their thoughts, share your own, and render a verdict based on the evidence and the law. That's what you swore to do, and that's what I'm asking you to do now. Clayton watched them walk to the jury box, watched the 3 substitutes step down with varying expressions of relief and disappointment, who watched the 12 original jurors, 9 who'd stayed safe and 3 who'd been left to die, come together to fulfill their obligation. Mackenzie sat frozen, his confidence shattered, his careful plans destroyed by one cowboy and a horse with good instincts. Clayton caught his eye and saw pure hatred there, saw a man who'd never been thwarted and couldn't accept what was happening. "Bailiff," Judge Hammond said, "escort the jury to the deliberation room. The rest of us will wait." As the jury filed out, Clayton finally allowed himself to relax. They'd made it. Against all odds, despite corruption and conspiracy and attempted murder, they'd made it. Justice would have its chance after all. But as he looked at Mackenzie's face, at the cold fury in those eyes, Clayton knew this wasn't over. Men like Mackenzie didn't accept defeat gracefully. They fought back, they sought revenge, they made people pay for crossing them. The verdict hadn't been delivered yet, and even after it was, there would be consequences. Clayton's hand drifted to his rifle. Whatever came next, he'd be ready for it. The wait was excruciating. The jury had been deliberating for 45 minutes, and every tick of the courtroom clock seemed to echo like thunder. Clayton stood near the back wall, positioned where he could watch both the doors and Mackenzie's table. Riley had joined him there, the former cavalry soldier's presence reassuring. Sheriff Morrison moved through the courtroom periodically, checking the doors, watching the crowd. Clayton had revised his opinion of the man. Morrison was honest, competent, and clearly not on Mackenzie's payroll. That was something, at least. But one honest sheriff didn't erase the fact that Mackenzie had enough resources to buy fake deputies and orchestrate murder. A woman sat in the front row, clutching a worn Bible and staring at the jury room door with fierce intensity. Rebecca Porter, Clayton realized, Jeremiah's widow. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back severely and a black dress that had seen better days. Her face showed the weight of grief and determination in equal measure. During a lull in the tension, she turned and caught Clayton's eye. After a moment's hesitation, she rose and walked back to where he stood. "You're the one who brought them back," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" The question was direct, searching. Clayton thought about how to answer, then decided simple truth was best. "Because it was the right thing to do, because your husband deserves justice and they were trying to steal it from you." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. Everyone else was afraid. The witnesses who ran away, the people who won't testify, the folks who cross the street when they see me coming because they don't want Mackenzie's anger turned their direction. "But you weren't afraid." "I was afraid," Clayton corrected gently. "Still am. But being afraid doesn't excuse doing nothing." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver locket, opening it to show him 2 faded photographs. A boy of maybe 5, a girl younger. Both children had their mother's dark hair, and what Clayton imagined was their father's smile. "These are my reasons for fighting," Rebecca said. "Thomas and Elizabeth. They need to know their father's death mattered, that justice exists, that good people stand up to evil. I was starting to think maybe I was wrong. Maybe the world doesn't work that way. Then you appeared." She closed the locket and pressed it into Clayton's hand. "Hold on to this until the verdict comes. It'll remind you what this is really about." Before Clayton could respond, she returned to her seat. He looked down at the locket, feeling its slight weight, and carefully tucked it into his shirt pocket. 2 children who'd lost their father. That's what this was about. Not abstract concepts of justice or law, but real people whose lives had been shattered by violence and greed. Movement at Mackenzie's table caught his attention. One of the lawyers was whispering urgently to his client, gesturing toward the door. Mackenzie's expression had gone from anger to calculation. Clayton's instincts prickled with warning. He moved closer to Sheriff Morrison. "You should know Mackenzie's lawyers are planning something. Watch them." Morrison nodded. "Already watching." Circuit Judge Trent posted 2 of his marshals outside. "If anyone tries to interfere with this verdict, they'll regret it." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Judge Trent appeared at Clayton's elbow. The old circuit judge studied him with shrewd eyes. "You've done something remarkable today, Mr. Rhodes. You've reminded people that ordinary citizens can stand up to power. That matters more than you might think. I just did what needed doing, sir. That's what makes it remarkable. Most people see what needs doing and find reasons not to do it. You didn't." Trent paused. "But you should know that men like Mackenzie don't forget slights. He'll come after you when this is done, one way or another." "Let him come," Clayton said quietly. "I've got nothing left for him to take except my life, and that's been borrowed time since Sarah died. I'm not afraid of Thaddeus Mackenzie." Trent smiled slightly. "I believe you, but fear and caution aren't the same thing. Be cautious, Mr. Rhodes. Stay alive long enough to see what your courage has built today." The judge moved away, and Clayton was left with his thoughts and the weight of Rebecca Porter's locket over his heart. The courtroom had grown hot with so many people packed into it, but nobody left. They all wanted to be there when the verdict came down. History was being made, and everyone could feel it. Riley spoke softly beside him. "I've been in battles where I knew exactly what was coming. Cavalry charges, you see the enemy line, you know the odds, you know what to expect. This is worse. Not knowing what 12 people are deciding in that room, it's harder than facing rifle fire." "At least with rifle fire you can shoot back," Clayton agreed. An hour passed. Then 90 minutes. The sun had long since set, and the courthouse glowed with lamplight against the darkness outside. Through the windows, Clayton could see people gathering in the square. Word had spread that something extraordinary was happening, and the whole town had turned out. He noticed something else too, groups of men in ranch clothes, standing in clusters, watching the courthouse with unfriendly expressions. Mackenzie's people, most likely. Not doing anything yet, but their presence was a message. We're here, we're watching, and there will be consequences. Sheriff Morrison saw them too, and sent deputies to keep an eye on the situation. The tension in the square was palpable, even from inside, a storm waiting to break. At the 2-hour mark, just when Clayton thought the wait might drive him mad, the door to the jury room opened. The bailiff stepped out, spoke quietly to Judge Hammond, and nodded. The judge's face remained carefully neutral as he struck his gavel. "The jury has reached a verdict. Everyone take your seats. I want absolute silence, or I will clear this courtroom." The noise of people settling was like a wave rushing against a shore. Clayton remained standing, his back against the wall, his eyes moving constantly between the jury box, Mackenzie's table, and the courtroom doors. His hand rested on his revolver, hidden beneath his coat. The jury filed in slowly, their faces showing the strain of deliberation. Margaret Chen looked exhausted but calm. William Brennan kept his eyes down, and Reverend Ashford walked with his shoulders squared, like a man who'd made peace with a difficult decision. The other 9 jurors showed various expressions of resignation, determination, or simple relief that this was finally ending. They took their seats, and Judge Hammond looked at them gravely. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" William Brennan stood. Apparently they'd elected him foreman. His voice was steady when he spoke. "We have, Your Honor. How do you find the defendant, Thaddeus Mackenzie, on the charge of murder in the first degree?" The courtroom held its collective breath. Clayton felt time stretch out, felt the weight of every eye fixed on William Brennan's face. Rebecca Porter gripped her Bible with white-knuckled hands. Mackenzie sat motionless, his expression carved from stone. William took a breath and spoke clearly, letting every word carry to the back of the room. "We find the defendant guilty." The courtroom exploded, shouting, crying, the crash of Judge Hammond's gavel, trying to restore order. Rebecca Porter collapsed forward, her body shaking with sobs of relief and grief mixed together. Clayton saw Mackenzie surge to his feet, his face contorted with rage, saw his lawyers grab him and force him back down. The cattle baron's eyes swept the room and locked on Clayton, and the promise of vengeance in that gaze was unmistakable. "Order!" Hammond roared. "I will have order, or I will jail every person in this courtroom." Gradually, the chaos subsided. Hammond looked at the jury with something that might have been respect. "Members of the jury, I thank you for your service. Your courage in the face of criminal interference honors this court and this territory." He turned to Mackenzie. Thaddeus Mackenzie, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of the crime of murder in the first degree. I hereby sentence you to hang by the neck until dead, sentence to be carried out 30 days hence at the territorial prison. May God have mercy on your soul. More chaos, but controlled this time. Sheriff Morrison and his deputies moved quickly to take Mackenzie into custody. The cattle baron went quietly, but his eyes never left Clayton. He was already planning, already calculating how to strike back. Men like Mackenzie always had contingencies, always had people loyal to them who'd carry out revenge, even if Mackenzie himself couldn't. Clayton pushed through the crowd to where Rebecca Porter still sat, overwhelmed by the verdict. He knelt beside her and spoke gently. "It's over, ma'am. Your husband's death has been answered." She looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Thank you. Thank you for everything. You gave me back my faith that justice exists." He handed her the locket. "Give this to your children. Tell them their father was a good man who stood up for what was right, and that good people made sure his death wasn't forgotten." Outside, the sound of angry voices was growing louder. Riley appeared at Clayton's side. "We should get out of here. Mackenzie's ranch hands are working themselves up, and I don't like the mood." Clayton nodded. He'd done what he came to do. The jury had delivered their verdict, justice had prevailed, and now it was time to fade back into the territories before revenge caught up with him. But as they moved toward the side exit, he took one last look at the courtroom, at the empty jury box, at Rebecca Porter clutching her children's locket, at the space where Mackenzie had sat. One battle won. But Clayton Rhodes knew from long experience that winning a battle wasn't the same as winning a war. And the war with Thaddeus Mackenzie was just beginning. They made it halfway across the square before the trouble started. Clayton had retrieved Copperhead from the livery where Riley had stabled her, and the mare seemed refreshed despite the day's hard work. Margaret, William, and Reverend Ashford walked with them, too keyed up from the verdict to think about rest. The night air was cool and clean after the stuffiness of the courtroom, and for a moment Clayton allowed himself to believe they might actually walk away from this without further incident. Then he heard the scrape of boots on gravel behind them, and his instincts flared with warning. "Keep walking," he said quietly to the others. "Don't look back, don't stop. Riley, get them to the hotel." "What about you?" Riley asked, his hand drifting toward the pistol on his hip. "I'll handle this. They're not after the jury anymore, the verdict's in. They're after me." 5 men had followed them from the courthouse, spreading out in a loose semicircle. Ranch hands, by the look of them, wearing the kind of hardness that came from years of rough living. The one in front was tall and lean, with a face like weathered leather, and eyes that held no warmth at all. "You're Clayton Rhodes," the man said. "It wasn't a question." "I am. Mr. Mackenzie wants a word with you. You'll come with us." Clayton stood easy, one hand resting on Copperhead's neck, the other hanging loose by his side. Close to his revolver, but not threatening, yet. "Mackenzie's on his way to jail," Clayton said calmly. "I don't reckon he's in much position to summon anyone. He's got 30 days before they hang him, plenty of time to settle accounts with people who wronged him. You wronged him bad, mister. Interfered with his business, cost him his freedom, probably cost him his life. That requires an answer." Behind Clayton, Riley had stopped. Clayton heard the distinctive sound of a hammer being pulled back on a revolver. The man said he's not interested. "Time for you boys to move along." The tall man's eyes flicked to Riley, assessed him, and dismissed him. Not because Riley wasn't dangerous, it was clear he was, but because the math still favored the ranch hands. 5 against 2, and one of the 2 was an old cowboy who looked tired from a long day. "This doesn't concern you, soldier boy," the tall man said. "This is between us and Rhodes." "Everything that happens in my town concerns me," a new voice said from behind the ranch hands. Sheriff Morrison stepped into view, flanked by 2 deputies. All 3 had their guns drawn and pointed at the ground, not threatening but ready. The sheriff's face was hard as granite in the lamplight from the street. "You boys have 30 seconds to clear out," Morrison said. "Otherwise, you'll be spending the night in my jail on charges of threatening violence and disturbing the peace. Your choice." The tall man's jaw worked, frustration and calculation warring on his face. He wanted this confrontation, needed it, maybe, to salvage some pride after Mackenzie's defeat. But 5 ranch hands against a sheriff, 2 deputies, a cavalry veteran, and whatever Clayton Rhodes turned out to be was different odds than he'd signed up for. "This isn't finished," he said, looking directly at Clayton. "Mr. Mackenzie has a long memory and a lot of friends. You best watch yourself out on the trail." "I always do," Clayton replied evenly. "But threats are easy to make. Following through is harder. If your boss wants to come after me, he knows where to find me. I'll be around." The 5 men backed away slowly, their eyes promising future violence. But they went, melting into the darkness beyond the square. Morrison waited until they were gone, then holstered his weapon. "You're making enemies, Mr. Rhodes." "Seems that way, but I didn't start this." "No, you didn't. You finished it, though, which might be worse in their eyes." Morrison studied him carefully. "You planning to stay in Sterling?" "Was planning to move on come morning, head to Carson City, find work for the winter." "Might be smart to move on tonight instead. Mackenzie's got a lot of men, and not all of them are smart enough to be scared of the law. Some of them might try something stupid." Clayton considered that. He was bone-tired, and Copperhead needed proper rest. But Morrison was right. Staying in Sterling was asking for trouble. Better to put distance between himself and Mackenzie's revenge while he still could. "I'll think about it," he said. Margaret Chen approached, her expression conflicted. "Mr. Rhodes, I know we've already asked so much of you, but would you consider staying one more night? The judge wants to take formal statements from all of us about what happened. It would help ensure Mackenzie can't appeal the verdict on procedural grounds." Clayton looked at her tired face, at the hope and determination still burning in her eyes. These people had been through hell, and they deserved to see this through completely. One more night wouldn't kill him, probably. "One night," he agreed, "but we all stay together, stay alert, and we leave at first light." "Agreed," Ashford said. The Reverend pulled out a pocket watch, the artifact of time that had driven them all day. "It's nearly 9 o'clock. We've been racing time since this afternoon, and now we've finally caught up with it. Perhaps we can rest for a few hours." Clayton hoped the Reverend was right. But as he looked at the dark buildings surrounding the square, at the shadows that might hold enemies, he knew rest would be difficult to find. The hotel room was modest but clean, with 2 beds and a window that overlooked the main street. Clayton insisted the 3 jury members share the room, while he and Riley took turns keeping watch in the hallway. It wasn't comfortable, but it was safer than splitting up. Around midnight, Clayton heard the first sounds of trouble. Horses moving quietly through the streets, men speaking in low voices, the creak of leather and jingle of spurs. He moved to the window and looked down to see shadows gathering in the alley across the street. 8, maybe 10 men, more than had confronted them earlier. "Riley," he said softly, and the former cavalryman was instantly alert. "How many?" "Too many for a friendly visit. Wake the others. We're leaving now." They moved quickly but quietly, gathering belongings and getting everyone ready. Clayton led them down the back stairs to the hotel's rear entrance, where it opened onto a narrow alley that ran behind the buildings. Copperhead was stabled 3 buildings down, and if they could reach her without being seen— A match flared in the darkness ahead, illuminating a face Clayton recognized. The tall ranch hand from earlier, standing in the alley with 3 others, blocking their escape route. "Told you this wasn't finished," the man said, his hand resting on his gun. Clayton's mind raced through options. They were trapped between 2 groups, the larger force out front and these 4 in the alley. Fighting their way through would mean shooting, and shooting would bring the law, but it would also mean people getting hurt. These jury members had already suffered enough. "Let them pass," Clayton said, gesturing to Margaret, William, and Ashford. "Your quarrel is with me. They've done nothing except their duty." The tall man shook his head. "Mr. Mackenzie says you all need to learn there's consequences for crossing him. Can't let that verdict stand unchallenged." "The verdict stands no matter what you do to us," Reverend Ashford said, his voice calm despite the danger. "Killing us doesn't change that. It just makes you murderers too." "We're just following orders," one of the other men said. But his voice carried doubt. Clayton saw the opening and pressed it. "Orders from a man who's going to hang in 30 days. What happens to you after he's dead? Who protects you from murder charges then? Who pays your legal fees? His empire's crumbling, boys. Don't go down with it." Movement from the front of the hotel, Sheriff Morrison and his deputies pouring into the alley from both ends, weapons drawn. Clayton realized someone must have alerted the law, probably the hotel owner who'd seen the ranch hands gathering. "Drop your weapons," Morrison ordered. "All of you, right now." The standoff froze. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the tall ranch hand's shoulders slumped, and he slowly pulled his revolver and set it on the ground. The others followed suit, their expressions a mixture of relief and resignation. They'd been given an out, a way to step back from a line they probably hadn't wanted to cross in the first place. Morrison's deputies moved in and began collecting weapons and binding hands. The sheriff approached Clayton with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and respect. "I had deputies watching the hotel, just in case." "Good thing, too," he looked at the ranch hands. "You boys just bought yourselves 30 days in my jail for attempted assault. Maybe by the time you get out, you'll have found better employment than working for a murderer." The tall ranch hand met Clayton's eyes one last time. "You got lucky, old man. Luck doesn't last forever." "Neither does loyalty to dead bosses," Clayton replied. "You might think about that while you're sitting in that cell." The deputies led the prisoners away, and Morrison turned to Clayton's group. "I'm assigning 2 men to watch your hotel room for the rest of the night. Come morning, I'll provide an escort to the edge of town. After that, you're on your own, but at least you'll have a head start." "Appreciate it, Sheriff," Clayton said. They returned to the hotel room, this time with 2 armed deputies posted outside. Clayton finally allowed himself to sit on one of the beds, feeling the full weight of exhaustion settle on him like a physical thing. His body ached, his mind was fuzzy with fatigue, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd been this tired. Margaret sat across from him, her own exhaustion evident. "Do you think it's really over?" "The immediate danger, maybe, but men like Mackenzie cast long shadows. We'll need to stay alert for a while yet." "I don't regret it," she said quietly. "Any of it, even being left to die in that wagon. Because we won. Justice won. That matters." Clayton thought about Sarah, about the ranch they'd lost, about all the times in his life when doing the right thing had cost him something. She'd always said the cost was worth it if you could sleep at night knowing you'd made the right choice. "Yes," he agreed, "it matters." Outside, the night slowly gave way to the grey light of pre-dawn. In a few hours they'd leave Sterling behind, scatter to their separate lives, carrying with them the knowledge that they'd stood together against corruption and prevailed. It wasn't much, but it was something. In this hard country, sometimes something was enough. Clayton finally let himself close his eyes, trusting the deputies outside to keep watch. For the first time in what felt like days, he allowed sleep to take him, dreaming of Sarah and Copperhead and a small ranch that existed now only in memory. Dawn broke clear and cold over Sterling, the sun painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. Clayton stood in the livery stable, running his hands over Copperhead's neck, checking her legs and hooves with careful attention. The mare had earned a week of rest and good feed, but she'd have to settle for breakfast and whatever he could give her on the trail. They had miles to cover before full daylight. "She's a remarkable horse," Reverend Ashford said from the stable doorway. "Saved all our lives with her instincts." "She did," Clayton agreed, feeding Copperhead a handful of oats. "Horses know things we don't, the smart ones anyway, and she's about as smart as they come." They assembled in the hotel dining room for a quick breakfast, coffee, biscuits, eggs cooked by the owner's wife, who refused payment when she learned who they were. News travelled fast in small towns, and their story had already become local legend. The cowboy who'd followed his horse into the desert and saved justice itself. Rebecca Porter arrived as they were finishing, her children in tow. Thomas and Elizabeth clung to their mother's skirts, shy in the presence of strangers. Rebecca's eyes were clearer this morning, some of the grief's raw edge softened by the verdict's closure. "I wanted to say goodbye properly," she said, "and to give you this." She handed Clayton a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside, he found one of Sarah's letters somehow she'd known, which was his favorite, and a new leather cord to replace the faded ribbon that had held them together. "I noticed how carefully you held those letters yesterday," Rebecca explained. "The ribbon was wearing through. I thought maybe you'd like something that would last longer." Clayton felt his throat tighten. It was a small gesture, but it spoke of observation and kindness, of someone who understood loss and the talismans we keep to fight it off. "Thank you," he managed. "That's thoughtful beyond words." Little Elizabeth tugged on her mother's dress and whispered something. Rebecca smiled and translated, "She wants to know if you're a hero." Clayton knelt down so he was eye level with the girl. "No, sweetheart, I'm just a man who did what needed doing. Your mama is the hero. She fought for your daddy when everyone else was too scared. That's real courage." But Elizabeth shook her head solemnly. "Mama says you're a hero because you helped even though you didn't have to. That's what heroes do." Out of the mouths of children, Clayton thought. Maybe there was truth in that simple understanding. But yesterday, he'd had purpose. He'd mattered. For the first time in 3 years, he'd felt like himself again. Sheriff Morrison arrived with his promised escort, 2 deputies on horseback who would ride with them to the edge of the county. The sheriff shook Clayton's hand firmly. "You did this territory a service yesterday, Mr. Rhodes. Stood up when others wouldn't. That means something." "Will it stick?" Clayton asked. "The verdict, or will Mackenzie's money find a way to undo it?" "Circuit Judge Trent is personally overseeing the appeal process. And between you and me, the territorial governor has been looking for a reason to break Mackenzie's power for years. This gives him that reason. I think it'll stick." They mounted up, Clayton on Copperhead, Riley on his own horse, the 3 jury members riding borrowed mounts that would be returned from the next town. The deputies took positions front and back, and they rode out through Sterling's quiet morning streets. At the edge of town, they paused. This was where their paths would diverge. Riley would return to his ranch, Margaret would go back to her school in Ridgemont, William would reopen his store, Ashford would return to his ministry, and Clayton would continue on to Carson City, to winter work and whatever came after. "I don't know how to properly thank you," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave us back our lives and our faith in the system. You did the hard part," Clayton replied. "You sat in that jury box and rendered an honest verdict even after everything you'd been through. That took more courage than following a horse into the desert." William extended his hand. "If you're ever in Ridgemont, you'll never pay for supplies in my store. That's a promise. I might take you up on that." Reverend Ashford produced his Bible, the one with the jury summons papers still tucked inside. "Would you mind if I said a blessing over you?" Clayton nodded, and the Reverend's words were simple and heartfelt. Protection for the journey, gratitude for courage, hope for peace. When he finished, they shook hands, and Clayton saw respect in the Reverend's eyes. The kind of respect that came from shared hardship and shared victory. They went their separate ways then, 5 people who'd been bound together by circumstance and crisis, now returning to their individual lives. Clayton watched them go, feeling something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been sadness, maybe both. He and Copperhead headed west, toward Carson City and whatever waited there. The morning sun warmed his back, and the desert stretched out before them in familiar patterns of sage and stone. It looked the same as it had yesterday morning, but everything felt different. He felt different. He thought about Sarah, about what she would say if she could see what he'd done. She'd probably smile that knowing smile of hers and tell him she'd never doubted him for a minute. That's how she'd always been seeing the best in him, even when he couldn't see it himself. There's a bond between a man and his horse that runs deeper than words. There's also a bond between a man and his conscience, between what we are and what we choose to be when nobody's watching. Clayton Rhodes had made his choice yesterday, and he'd make it again if faced with the same situation. The desert swallowed them up, 1 aging cowboy and 1 faithful horse, heading toward the horizon. Behind them, justice had been served. Ahead, the future waited.